Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad you have accepted your role in this mission. The first thing we're going to look at is ancient Greece. We're going to look at ancient Greece geography. And to start off with the geography, allow me to move over here and talk about some of the things that we need to be focused on. If you will see, Greece is what we call a peninsula. Okay, it is a peninsula. Actually, it's sort of like two peninsulas. So this is the word we want to look at here. And peninsula is a piece of land that is almost completely surrounded by water. Now, where I say there's two peninsulas is you have the first peninsula, which is right here with Greece, and the other peninsula, sometimes referred to as Peloponnese, or Peloponnesus. This is the other peninsula, and you have a piece of land right here, which is called an isthmus. That is an isthmus, a narrow strip of land surrounded by two larger bodies of water, and that's what connects these two peninsulas of ancient Greece. Okay, but Greece, looking at this map, Greece is and this is a physical map which shows us the topography of an area. Okay, and so looking at this particular map, we can notice that the various colors represent various altitudes or geographical features. If you notice, there's a lot of mountain ranges. There's a mountain range that goes right through the center part of Greece. And what this caused, and you have some other mountain ranges in here and all over Greece, okay? And the various mountain ranges made the soil very rocky. And so people, especially in the ancient world, they didn't really have the ability to cross these mountain ranges very easily, nor was the soil deep enough for them to create and cultivate large crops of land and the traditional crops that we might think of here today, where we can grow grain or corn or something along those lines. So they focused on other resources, olives, olive oil, things like that, grapes, vineyards that they could cultivate. The climate in this area was a very mild climate, especially in the wintertime. And so it was winters were not typically harsh unless you got further north, then it might get a little bit harsher in the winter. But down in the southern part of Greece, things were pretty mild in climate. But because Greece was so divided with these mountains, what you had the emergence of city-states. And each city basically became a state unto itself. And that's why we use the word city-states when we describe the cities of Greece. And so there are countries in themselves. They developed their own culture, their own value system, their own belief systems. And so a lot of this is very important. Two important city-states that we're going to discuss and we need to know about in this particular for ancient Greece is Athens, which emerges down in about this area. So Athens is one important city-state. And Athens kind of had a sphere of influence that controlled many of the other various city-states that were nearby it. They became like partners, so to speak, collaborators, or subservient to Athens. The other one is Sparta, which would be over in this area on Peloponnesus. So Sparta. Okay, so those are the two major city-states that we're going to talk about. And Sparta has its own sphere of influence, which focused on the peninsula of Peloponnesus, and therefore. When we look at these various city-states, as we said, each of them developed their own culture. They also developed their own type of government. But before we get into government, one of the things I want to talk about is social order. In the ancient world, various societies, and maybe this is something you've learned about in the past, but basic societies, you had various classes of people. And based on your class is where you stood in the hierarchy of things. Because in the ancient world, people did not understand the world. They looked to the gods, and gods were seen in control of a variety of elements throughout life itself. Priests become and take a very important role in ancient society. The priests often serve the king, or the king, I should say, serves because the priests support that king and his rule. Now, the king usually came from the warrior class. Usually he's one of the strongest or best warriors. So that is who takes over the mantle of king, is this warrior class. But the warriors had to defend and protect the area. And that's just something that's common that most people have when it comes to government, is you need an army to protect yourself from invaders or from other forces from the outside that might try to take what you have. And then lastly, you have peasants. So when I do an ancient social hierarchy, we're going to focus on these four things. So you have a king who typically rules in an ancient world, one leader. Priests, warriors help defend it. Priests help connect the people to the needs of the gods, offer up sacrifice to the gods. And then finally, the peasants are the people who are your laborers, your artisans, and a variety of other things. As we go through history, or as we look at some of these things in the ancient world, we'll talk about how some of those change depending on where you're at in society and the time period. So going with this basic model of the traditional sense of how a lot of civilizations created a basic government, the most common government you might find, especially in some of the Greek city-states, is some form of a monarchy. Okay, so when we talk about a monarchy, we talk about a king or queen who rules. And the only people who can rule then are someone who's related to the king or queen by blood, usually a prince or someone who comes up beyond that. Now, what comes with being a king or queen, because usually you can't just do it by yourself. You need the support of someone else. And in some cases, like the ancient world, you either have the support of the priests or support of some warriors too to help defend it because they believe they're loyal. So in a monarchy, you typically give people titles, and we'll kind of talk about that later because it applies with one of the other governments that we talk about. So a king or queen, they have the royal birth, something royal blood in them, and so that gives them the right to rule, and their family can rule after them. However, in Greece, sometimes someone who wasn't of royal birth took power and took control of the government. A person like that would often be called a tyrant, and a tyranny would be an illegal form of government, at least in the eyes of the king or queen. That would be an illegal form of government. But someone who is not of royal birth takes control, that would be a tyranny. Sometimes you don't have one person ruling or one person at the head of the government making decisions. Instead, you might have something we call an oligarchy, where a few people rule, a small group of people. I like to look at that as like sometimes the Communist Party, because they kind of pick the next leader. They are seen as similar to an oligarchy. Usually it's very wealthy citizens who gain influence and wealth in the city, and so therefore they kind of take control, because with, as I always say, with money comes power. Very important idea to remember. Or as they say, the golden rule is, he who has the gold makes the rules. So an oligarchy, wealthy people, it's a few small group of people that take control. And an aristocracy is something I said before. An aristocrat is a noble person, someone who is granted a title. I mentioned that up here. A title by the king or queen is an aristocrat. So a title might be baron, duke, earl, something along those lines. And so they're granted a title. Well, sometimes the aristocracy, this group of nobles, they don't like what the king is doing, or the king's son might be a weak ruler, and so therefore they decide to overthrow that person, and so they take control. So when an aristocracy is a form of oligarchy, but it is where nobles rule the government. And the last type of government that kind of started here in ancient Greece, and we're going to kind of focus on, and it's going to be an important thing in a future video, is democracy. And the birthplace of democracy is Athens. Okay, Athens. And democracy is something that some people are familiar with. It is where the people rule. In Athens, they had something that we call direct democracy, where all the members of a certain voting age got to vote on policy. In the United States, they had what we call an indirect democracy, where people vote for representatives to rule on their behalf.